While Franklin Zimring's work, The City That Became Safe, focuses on the low crime rate that New York City has enjoyed over the last 20 years, the book also makes an attempt to provide insights into the late 1980s crime expansion that occurred in a growing number of disadvantaged and over-socialized youth. Zimring points out that this indeed occurred in big cities all throughout the United States. He contends that some criminologists attributed this surge in crime to juvenile superpredators, high-rate, repeat offenders. Whatever the reason for this rise in crime, the U.S. began to expand its use of incarceration. More and more prisons and jails were being built in the 1990s to warehouse these super predators. There is no question that the crack cocaine phenomenon also coincided with America's incarceration rate increasing. Conflict over turf and crack markets resulted in devastating violence, and legislators and the media responded by demonizing crack cocaine. But what is interesting is that even though the city of New York saw a modest expansion of its youth population, it did not see a surge in crime. So the prediction of increased rates of offending made by the media and by various politicians was simply wrong in the case of New York City. And what is particularly remarkable is that, unlike other major metropolitan areas, New York City did not see an increase in its penal confinement. The incarceration rate significantly expanded all throughout the nation between 1990 and 2005. However, New York City was one of the few exceptions, and today it locks up an even smaller fraction of its youth and young offenders than it did in the early and mid-1990s. Of course, it should be noted that the crack cocaine crisis occurred in New York just as it did in virtually every other major American city throughout the 1990s and into the new millennium. And even today, in spite of the fact that many scholars have acknowledged that the war on drugs was a failed experiment, more persons are in prison for drug offenses than for virtually any other type of crime. In his book, Zimring does a remarkably good job of illustrating that New York City has a large drug epidemic. For example, he points to phone surveys which clearly reflect that residents within New York City admit to using drugs such as cocaine and heroin more frequently than individuals in other major cities. Cocaine use is especially prevalent within New York City. Interestingly, according to Professor Zimring, the price of drugs in New York also tend to be on the lower end of the spectrum when compared to the price of drugs in other metropolitan areas throughout the U.S. While he does not specifically make this point in his book, it could be that an increased availability within New York City drives down the price. Franklin Zimring also highlights the Kansas City Preventive Patrol Experiment. The Kansas City Preventive Patrol Experiment was a landmark experiment carried out between 1972 and 1973, and it was designed to test the assumption that the presence or potential presence of police in marked cars reduced the likelihood of a crime being committed. This experiment is very, very important. It was the first study to demonstrate that it was the first study to demonstrate the effectiveness of different styles of policing. And this is very important also because it highlights the classical experimental design. And for those of you who have not yet taken a research methods course, a classical experimental design is where you have one independent variable, in this case police patrol, and it is administered to what is known as the experimental group. Meanwhile, the control group does not receive the independent variable. And there are typically two sets of observations, although there can be more, and they're utilized as part of the classical experimental design. One of these observations comes before the administration of the independent variable. In this case, the independent variable would be police patrol. And then there is the second observation, and that comes after the administration of the independent variable, again being police patrol. Typically, this allows researchers to reduce what are known as the threats to internal validity and isolate the effects of the independent variable. So you're probably wondering, what did researchers find in the Kansas City Preventive Patrol experiment? Well, interestingly enough, and you've read the book, so you know this, the findings were not what you might expect. According to the results of this study, citizens did not notice the difference when the frequency of patrols was changed. Another one of the major findings of this study was that increasing or decreasing the level of patrol had no significant effect on property crimes. Additionally, citizen satisfaction with police did not vary between the experimental and the control group, and the rate at which crimes were reported did not differ significantly across the beats. Finally, citizen satisfaction with the police did not vary. The Kansas City patrol experiment drew the conclusion that routine preventive patrol in marked police cars has little value in preventing crime or making citizens feel safe, and that resources normally allocated to these activities could safely be allocated elsewhere. So what does this all mean? Is routine patrol, which is the hallmark of virtually any police department, fruitless? Firefighters do not patrol the streets looking for fires, so why should police patrol the streets looking for crime, right? Well, perhaps this is not a perfect analogy, but it does beg the question, is policing in the United States being conducted in the most efficient manner? Are departments doing everything they can to emulate the extremely effective model found in Japan? And why is policing within the U.S. so extremely decentralized? Professor Zimring points out more than once in his book that America is a nation of over 20,000 police departments. In fact, policing is really the only major criminal justice agency that is usually under municipal control. Why do you suppose this is? It should be noted that even though this book acknowledges New York City's low crime rate, the NYPD has never been regarded as a truly great police department. In fact, it has a long history of scandals and corruptions. If you remember, we examined Edith Lynn's book, which illustrated how grossly inefficient this police agency can be in some aspects. So while it would certainly be unfair to give all of the credit to NYPD, there are some things that perhaps it has done right, and Zimring's going to talk about that later on in the book. But for now, for what we're concerned with, he does point out that it is an extremely large police agency. It has over 17,000 officers, okay? So given the size of this bureaucracy, it may not be a surprise that there are, lots of inefficiencies, lots of red tape, perhaps even more scandals than one would observe in a smaller department. To me, a fascinating aspect of Zimring's book is when he examines police operations within the city of New York. He provides strong evidence that the NYPD changed its priorities as to what crimes to crack down on and which ones to ignore. For example, from 2000 to 2009, prostitution arrests in New York City fell by 54%. Why did this happen? Certainly, it is not because there were a lack of opportunities for officers to make prostitution-related arrests. I just don't think you can make this assumption. So why was there a fundamental shift in priorities? And during the same time period, the gambling arrest, again, it fell, and it fell 82%. So why did the NYPD lose their enthusiasm for arresting suspects who engaged in victimless crimes at a time when New York City police officers were using very aggressive street tactics to fight crime? These are important questions which are worth further examination and discussion. Today, of course, gun ownership is perhaps one of the hottest issues in criminal justice, and as Zimring points out, it is certainly within the realm of possibility that New York's low crime rate may have been assisted by its low rates of civilian handgun ownership. Zimring also argues that the city's sheer volume of police officer may also be somewhat attributable to the low crime rate that its residents have enjoyed over the last 20 years. Manpower is very expensive. However, in the case of New York, it may have very well been a smart investment. Zimring also maintains that the aggressive use of stops and frisks have helped to assist the NYPD officers in lowering the crime rate. For those of you, by the way, who do not know the landmark case Terry v. Ohio, which was in 1968, the U.S. Supreme Court permitted police officers to search a suspect if they had reasonable suspicion that he or she was carrying a gun. Though the court in this case did not fully define the concept of reasonable suspicion, it is a standard which is significantly less than probable cause, which is what's required to make an arrest. This still today is a very controversial decision, even though it was made decades ago. I think it's ironic it was made during the Warren Court, which tended to hand down very pro-defendant, pro-inmate decisions. Well, this is one exception that definitely benefited law enforcement. Incidentally, some city police departments, even today, do not permit their officers to make Terry stops. This is forbidden by some agencies. For example, officers in Chicago are forbidden to make Terry stops. Some critics have suggested that this may be due in part to the part of the reason why Chicago has one of the highest violent crime rates, not only in the U.S., but in the world, when you compare it to Western democracies and so forth. And so what do you think about stop and frisk policies? You may remember we read Peter Mosco's book, Cop in the Hood, and he says that some agencies in training actually teach their officers to use these stop and frisk techniques as a pretext for locking up drug offenders. And there has been quite a bit of research that has shown that aggressive policing tactics often impose significant hardships on the minority poor. So should police officers continue to use these aggressive policing tactics even if they pose a significant burden on members of the lower class who are at a significant disadvantage to begin with? One aspect of Zimring's book that is certainly worth paying attention to is that police officers in New York City have aggressively made marijuana-related arrests for the last 15 years. In 2009, there were 46,487 individuals arrested in New York City for marijuana-related offenses. Okay? Many of these individuals were arrested for having small amounts of marijuana on their person or for smoking marijuana in public. Of course, there were also individuals who were arrested for dealing marijuana, but still, almost 50,000 people a year arrested for marijuana-related crimes. In Colorado and Washington, the drug has been legalized for recreational purposes, but apparently the NYPD still cracks down on this drug, and they do it very, very hard. By way of comparison, the NYPD arrested only 891 individuals for marijuana-related offenses in 1990. So why do you suppose that only 19 years later, the city of New York would see almost a 50-fold increase in marijuana-related arrests? In your opinion, is this productive policing, or is it a waste of departmental resources? Does New York City enjoy its low crime rate because of or in spite of these marijuana-related arrests? Think about these questions as you continue reading Franklin Zimring's book, The City That Became Safe.